U.S. airstrikes between the Iraqi cities of Erbil and Mosul have now killed at least 16 ISIS militants. At least that is according to health and civil defense officials there. President Barack Obama, we saw him this morning saying that U.S. airstrikes have successfully destroyed arms and equipment of ISIS militants in northern Iraq. And he added, though, that it will be up to Iraq to unite and stop this Islamic militant group. But could these airstrikes have unintended consequences for the West? Let me bring in CNN terrorism analyst Paul Cruikshank, who penned an opinion piece on precisely that, and CNN national security analyst and former CIA operative Bob Baer. Gentlemen, appreciate you coming in on a Saturday. And Paul Cruikshank, just because you wrote this piece and you outlined it pretty specifically, but let me just begin with generally here with the U.S. going in with this airstrike campaign. I know ISIS has really been specific to the Iraq-Syria region, but might this mean retaliation in Europe or the U.S.?
It could mean that. It could mean that ISIS could unleash attacks in Europe or even the United States. They're actually quite well positioned to do that. They've got training camps. They've got tens of millions of dollars. They've also got up to about 1,000 European recruits in their ranks and also dozens of Americans. And so the concern is that they could train some of these people and send them back to Europe or even the United States to carry out attacks, Brooke.
Bob Baer, specifically in the United States, what are your sources telling you about ISIS?
Well, it's true that they are in a position to hit us either in Europe, places in the Middle East. Now, law enforcement sources have been telling me for a long time, for months, that ISIS is here within U.S. borders. There's specifically traced ISIS members that have come across the Mexican border. They're not, of course, U.S. passport holders, but they're in this country. They came under false identities, and they believe they're capable of carrying out terrorism attacks inside this country.
Are they here for precisely that reason?
That's what they believe. They said the Mexican border, yes, the children are coming across, but their major concern is that terrorists are coming back to make attacks here. And I asked for specifics, and of course, I don't work for the government, so they couldn't tell me. And they just went silent.
Wow, that is the first I've heard of that. Paul, let me just ask you, off of your opinion piece, you lay out these three different ways that ISIS could retaliate. In the third piece, you mentioned lone wolves, and you use the Boston bombing as a perfect example of extremists not having to be trained going overseas, learning how to make a bomb on the internet, and that is one of your fears.
Well, that is a real fear. ISIS has a lot of supporters in the West, particularly in Europe, and there's concern that they could lash out with some sort of lone wolf attack back in Europe or even the United States. ISIS supporters at the moment have put out a Twitter campaign calling for exactly this, calling for attacks against the United States, attacks against Europe. But from a European perspective, there's a lot of concern because hundreds of fighters have come back to Europe who've been fighting in Syria and Iraq, and many of them actually were fighting with ISIS. And back in May, we saw an attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, and that was carried out by a former ISIS member, a French-Algerian militant who had spent a year in Syria and come back to Europe. And the concern is we could see more of these kind of attacks now triggered by these U.S. strikes against ISIS in Iraq.
What about more imminently, Bob Baer, in country, in Iraq, when we wonder about the thirst level of retaliation among these ISIS militants? We know that they have seized this hydroelectric dam in Mosul. You and I have talked on TV before where you really were fearful that potentially that could be used as really a weapon of mass destruction, right, to flood the Tigris, to flood people south, potentially as far as Baghdad. Do you still believe that's a possibility?
Well, Brooke, I do, and here's the way it would work. Saddam in the mid-90s built military canals along the Tigris that spread out from the Mosul Dam. And the purpose of that was to specifically go after an invasion in the south, and the Shia in particular. ISIS is capable, they have engineers on the dam today, of doing that very thing. And I think if you put them, their back against the corner, they very well could do this. I don't know specific plans, but that's certainly a fear in Iraq today.
I think the biggest headline out of this conversation came from you, Bob Baer, about your sources, your law enforcement sources saying ISIS is in the U.S., coming over the Mexican border.